I had two interesting jobs in my life. One, I was on the USS John R. Craig, a ship that Rick served on. So we were not shipmates at the same time, but he served shortly after I did. And while I was on John R. Craig, I stood watches with a future Chief of Naval Operations, Mike Borda. I went to another ship after going to an extended school, and a future Chief of Naval Operations and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff worked for me. So that I would call interesting to have stood under one CNO and been the boss of another CNO.
I'm Lawrence Widener, and so it's an interesting job.
Interesting job.
So interesting kind of part-time job is I have cows. I bought some cows, and I got head-butted by a cow yesterday in my hip, which really made me mad.
That's a big animal.
But I have artificial hips. They're titanium, so it really didn't hurt. But
Good thing. Wow.
2 years ago, I'd have been even madder.
Well, I'm sure that we were all moved by that. Okay, yes ma'am. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, what I'd like to do is pass this around if you would be so kind as to give us your information. And also, we have some cards here that has the YouTube station contact information, because all of these classes are on YouTube. And Jamie here graciously records the class for us. Thank you very
Jamie.
much.
Appreciate it.
But I'll leave this up here in case you want to get the address, and I'll start with you.
Yeah, I've been checking, and they've had like hundreds of millions of hits, this class.
I've told you a million times, don't exaggerate.
Number 4 on the 10.
All right, let's see here. Let's go ahead and start with prayer. Denny, I'm going to ask you to lead us in prayer, please, and we'll get started.
Heavenly Father, we're so thankful to be in a group like this where it's obvious that people love you and have dedicated their life to learning more about you. And we thank you for fun and frivolous times, and we thank you for serious times, and pray that as we now focus on studying the book of Esther, that you will indeed open our minds and our hearts to the message that Bob has for us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Okay, last week we left off, you'll recall that Esther became the queen after, I guess, a night of passion with Xerxes, the king. We're in Ezra chapter 1. Ezra chapter 3 right now.
Ezra or
Esther. Excuse me, Esther. Yeah, you got to get the right book. I'm not getting enough sleep these days, but Esther chapter 3. But towards the end of chapter 3, you'll recall Haman, who just comes in the picture here, issues a decree of death against the Jews. He gets upset with Mordecai. In fact, the Hebrew is very explicit. It says he got his panties all in a bunch. Okay, that's not what the Hebrew says, but it says he was very angry. He was indignant that Mordecai would not bow down to him when he came by. I've noticed that many people in this church don't bow down to me when I walk around. Is it something I have said? Anyway, Mordecai, Xerxes said that people should bow down to Haman, and Mordecai refused to do it, so he got upset. So he manipulates Xerxes into issuing a decree of death against the Jews. And so Xerxes gives Haman complete carte blanche authority. In other words, he gives him his signet ring, and which is used to seal and sign royal documents. Whoever possessed the signet ring effectively held the king's authority. And Xerxes blindly And again, we don't get a very good picture of Xerxes, do we? He was rash, impetuous, didn't think through his decisions, and here he is proving himself to be very gullible and very manipulative. And so he gives Haman full authority of the throne to do as he pleases. And once the law was signed, it would be irrevocable. So, to determine the best time for the attack on the Jews, Haman consults the Pur, which we know that the Jewish feast of Purim comes from this book. Archaeologists have unearthed samples of Purim, which were clay cubes inscribed with either cuneiform characters or dots, and they look almost identical to modern dice. So I don't know if they were playing craps back there in Persia 3,000 years ago, but anyway, casting the lot literally meant throwing the dice. But unlike their modern use, the ancient lot was not used for gambling, but for divination. And so when you cast the pure, it was a way of asking the gods for answers to questions about the future. Now, we don't do that, do we? No, we would not, as a certain president once did, had his wife consult an astrologer in California and make decisions of national security based on that. Anybody remember Ronald Reagan? We don't do that, do we? No. Anyway, Haman casts the lot in the first month of Nisan, the month the Jews celebrate Passover, and it falls on the 12th month, Adar. Haman will have to wait 11 months to attack the Jews. Now, I'm sure he was probably hoping it would come up next month. But he had 11 months, and so he wastes no time. He sends out the decree sealing their fate. Now, you remember they had like a Persian Pony Express, and they would send these things out to the 127 provinces. And so this edict of death is sent out on the 13th day of the first month, which ironically is the eve of Passover. The decree orders the citizens of Persia to take up arms against their Jewish neighbors, killing young and old, women and children, exactly 11 months later on the 13th day of the 12th month. Now, I don't think we can miss the irony of the time, can we? Passover commemorates the deliverance of Israel from Egypt. It was a historical event that constituted the founding of God's covenant people as a nation. It celebrates the existence of the Jews as a people who have a special relationship to God. And so the irony of this is that the joy of this holiday is turned to sorrow when the decree is delivered on Passover. It's kind of like on your birthday. You're celebrating your birthday, and then you get news that someone close to you has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. That would really spoil your day, wouldn't it? The Holocaust, I think, was similar in that the Nazis attempted to exterminate the Jewish people for the simple fact that they were Jews. And so the world is shown to be a very dangerous place where it is not in the king's best interest to tolerate the people of God. Now, there's an interesting contrast used in the final sentences of chapter 3, if you'll look there. While the collaborators celebrate, the people in Susa are aghast. It says, but the city of Susa was bewildered. The popular reaction to this decree is just one of bewilderment. You know, why would the king sign off on this decree? What could have possibly led to this? The ordinary citizen is probably asking. Now let's talk about God's mysterious working. Remember we said that a good theme for this book could be the providence of God. Most of us like to think that, through thoughtful planning and wise living, which I think all of us have done, right? We can successfully direct the course of our lives, right? We have a lot of older people in here. We have some younger people in here. But, we save up for retirement. We invest wisely. Hopefully, we have a pension. My understanding is that a lot of younger people are not going to have pensions in the future. But we look forward to years of comfortable living until we die. Except for they don't tell us that, all this comfortable living, we got a lot of aches and pains and stuff stops working. But most of the time, life plays along with us, doesn't it? In fact, in about 99 out of 100 instances, things go exactly as planned. But there's always the unexpected. The cancer, the heart attack, the stock market plunge. There's an old rabbinic saying in the Talmud, man plans, God laughs. In some cases, things spiral out of our control. A heart attack, cancer, a stock market plunge, our sense of ultimately being in control of our lives is revealed to be an illusion. And whether we like it or not, so we sometimes feel caught in circumstances that are beyond our control. Have you ever been like that? Life is full of seemingly insignificant events that in retrospect we recognize as changing the course of our lives. Now, Esther suffered the humiliation of being taken into the king's court. I believe that she was sexually abused. I believe that she was raped that night. And apparently, when they took her into the king's harem, nobody asked her what her plans might have been for her life. But her plans for life, whatever they were forever changed when the king's men seized her from her home. Mordecai suffered the humiliation when he was deprived of his rightful reward. Remember? He reported the assassination attempt on King Xerxes. And all the while, Haman was gaining power. And it's a sad irony, isn't it? And it's a sad reality. And you'll see this in your life, that sometimes the wicked prosper. How many billionaires do you know of that are Bible-believing Christians?
Hobby Lobby guy.
Who?
The Hobby Lobby people.
The Hobby Lobby people, okay?
Sir.
There you go, that's one. But personally, I don't know any billionaires, personally. And that's the only one that I know that has a Christian testimony. But the wicked prosper. In fact, Psalm 73 talks about that. Why do the wicked prosper? But God's people are often overlooked and unrewarded. Now, the book of Revelation, which I think Jason is going to start a series on that today, isn't he? Was written to encourage Christians who, like the Jews of Susa, found their existence threatened when the government under which they lived turned against them. Now, we American Christians probably can't fully appreciate the situation because there's never been a time in our our nation's history when the government has issued a decree outlawing the church or demanding a respect that compromises our allegiance to Jesus Christ. Yes, it's true, we may be ridiculed by your friends and your coworkers, We may be ridiculed in the media or disrespected in society. I mean, when's the last time you watched a movie or a television show in which a fundamentalist Christian, evangelical Christian, was treated respectfully? Usually, they're considered to be kind of wild-eyed wackos. You know what I mean? But our lives are not at risk because we are Christians in the United States. And unfortunately, this has not been the experience of Christians in other parts of the world. Denny just gave me a book, Tortured for Christ. You actually want me to read this year?
I do.
I don't have, you know what I'm doing, right?
I know.
I don't have time to read that this year. You want this back, right?
Sometime.
Okay, well, it's not going to be this year because I'm working on a book, but I will get around to it. And there's also a blog about the martyrs around the world. Who has that? What is it called?
Voice of the Martyrs.
Voice of the Martyrs, yes.
Founded by that author.
Right, okay. I get that every day. I read it from time to time. Very interesting. But it has been estimated that in the 20th century, an average of 300,000 Christians were martyred each year. Now, I don't know how accurate they are, but that's pretty sobering. All right, let's move on to chapter 4, unless there are any questions in chapter 3. We have the fallout of Haman's decree. It's on in your outline. I'm not sure what page that is, but in response to the royal decree to kill the Jews, Mordecai tears his garments. He dons sackcloth and ashes, and he wails loudly and bitterly through the city. He stops at the king's gate because public expressions of grief and protest were not allowed in the palace complex. Limiting direct access to kings was another way of limiting their exposure to problems and danger. And it would be kind of like if you tried to go to Washington, D.C. and you tried to get into the White House unless you were on a tour. I don't think you would get very far. If you came in and said, I really have a concern about my taxes, how many of you think that you would get in to see the president?
No.
Good. I'm glad nobody raised it. I'm the only idiot that raised my hand. You would not. The president would limit his exposure to the common people, which was what we would be, I would imagine. Even royal wives such as Esther had limited access to their husbands. And as the news of the edict spreads, Jews throughout the empire similarly mourned with fasting, weeping, and wailing. And we're told that many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Now, we in the West, we're conditioned to keeping our grief sometimes unexpressed. We don't weep, we don't wail, go crazy. And we might tend to think that Mordecai's demonstration is a bit melodramatic. But Israel and many of her Near Eastern neighbors shared grief and mourning rituals that expressed pain and anguish, and in some cases even caused physical pain. I think some people even cut themselves. These rituals included tearing clothes, and again, they probably had robes. They didn't have a Brooks Brothers shirt. This is not Brooks Brothers, but they included wearing coarse sackcloth, woven from goat or camel hair next to the skin, which I don't think would be really, it wouldn't be like silk. Rubbing ashes into the skin, and sleeping on a bed of ashes. Now, these were symbolic gestures, but they were often accompanied by tears, wailing, lamenting, and prayers for help and forgiveness. You might recall when Jacob heard about his son Joseph, his favorite son, had been torn apart by wild animals. Jacob tore his clothes. Joshua and Jacob wanted to tear their clothes when they heard that the Israelites wanted to return to Egypt rather than enter into the promised land. Remember that? I remember when I was a pastor, and I had people complaining about me and different things. Can you believe that? You know what I wanted to say, and I never did say it to my credit. I wanted to say, "I'll go on back to Egypt," but I did not say that. Even the pagan king of Nineveh commanded his people to fast and wear sackcloth and call on God and repent of their evil ways in the book of Jonah. The prophet Ezra, as we saw last week, reacted the same way when he heard that the Jews in Jerusalem had intermarried with Gentiles. Now, there are some who believe that Mordecai staged this public mourning to garner the support of Esther, as well as the Persians who were already confused by Xerxes' edict. On the other hand, and whoever has the Joel passage, please be ready here. On the other hand, the prophet Joel calls for such a response so that God will hear their prayers. Who has Joel 2:12 and 13?
That is why the Lord says, turn to me now while there is time. Give me your hearts. Come with fasting, weeping, and mourning. Don't tear your clothes in your grief. Instead, tear your hearts. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful. He is not easily angered. He is filled with kindness and is eager not to punish you.
Okay, thank you. Now, keep in mind that when all this is happening, Esther has been married to Xerxes for about 5 years. And during her 5 years of marriage to Xerxes, Esther was cut off from contact with Mordecai, and they would communicate through intermediaries. But she kept track of his activities. When she learned through her maid and eunuchs about Mordecai's mourning, she's concerned, and she sends him clothing to replace his sackcloth. And when he refuses her gift, she sends an intermediary to approach Mordecai to find out what's troubling him. So, yeah, I mean, that makes sense that she would not be able to have contact with him. You know, once she became the queen, I have a kid that I grew up with, Larry Hogan, who, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he was about 4 years younger. I used to drive him around. He and I used to go around and put up signs for our dads for elections. His dad was a congressman, and my dad was running for House of Delegates. But Larry Hogan and I used to message back and forth on Facebook, and then he became governor of Maryland. And guess what? I can't get through. Apparently, he doesn't even know me anymore. But no, I think it's the gatekeepers. You know, I can't get through the gatekeepers anymore. So I'll wait till he's no longer governor, and I'm sure he'll be able to I'll be able to access him again. But anyway, beginning in verse 6, and in your outline it says Mordecai enlists Esther's intervention. When Hathach went to Mordecai in the open square of the city, apparently Hathach was a eunuch. Esther knew nothing about the edict against the Jews. Can you imagine that? She knew nothing about it. She's living in the palace. She's married to Xerxes. You would think that she would have some kind of an idea what's going on. She doesn't. So when Mordecai refuses the clothing, Esther sends her most trusted eunuch to get information so that she might find out what's troubling him. Mordecai provides Esther with precise information about the amount of money that Haman is willing to pay to kill the Jews. He also provides her with written proof of the threat. Now keep in mind that Haman always seems to be well informed. He's the one who overheard the assassination threat against Xerxes. Now, there are some people, aren't there, who always seem to be in the know, and Mordecai was one of them. In our neighborhood, there was a guy who used to sit out in front of his house, and people would walk by, and he was the one that, you know, if you wanted to find out what was going on in the neighborhood, you went and talked to him and his dog Tyson. I think Tyson actually was the brains behind the outfit. But Joe was the one that you went and talked to if you want, you know, hey, what's going on over there? Oh, and he would know, because he was all, you know, his ear was always to the ground. But Mordecai was one of those people. He always seemed to have his ear to the ground. Now notice how Mordecai treats Esther now more like a daughter than a queen. She's been queen for 5 years. We're told that he urges her to use her position, power, and influence over Xerxes to convince him to act on behalf of the Jews. In fact, the Hebrew verb is even more emphatic. It says here he literally commands her. Commands her? Hey, Mordecai, do you know who I am? I'm the queen. He commands her. Now, you'll recall previously Mordecai had instructed Esther to hide her Jewish identity for whatever reason. Now, after she's been married for about 5 years, he's telling her that in a conflict between the state and her Jewish identity, her faith and her identification with the Jewish people must take priority. And so she sends back a report giving her objections for getting involved. Now, she knows Persian law, and she knows, after 5 years, the impulsive nature of her husband. You know, you've been living with somebody for 5 years, you get to know that person pretty well. We're going to get to that in a minute. It's not like they were sleeping in the same bed every night. But she knows that Vashti, her predecessor, the queen before her, was deposed on a whim, remember? And also keep in mind that she hasn't seen her husband in 30 days. Apparently, they didn't sleep together every night in the same bed. She begs off getting involved by explaining that she just can't go see the king uninvited without risking her life. Now, the Greek historian Herodotus tells us that the Persian kings enforced a law that was first instituted by a fellow by the name of Deioces the Mede, forbidding anyone to approach the king without a summons. So you couldn't just walk into a room where the king was without possibly being killed. And so the correct protocol was to request an audience with the king through a messenger eunuch, and then await an invitation from the king. Now, I've been waiting for a while to get my audience with the president. Okay, I'm kidding. I didn't put in for that, but I think you would probably wait a long time. I've never had an audience with the Pope. I guess he just doesn't know who I am. But anyway, there were only 7 men in the court who were permitted to see the face of the king. They were known, you know, they were his closest advisors. They were known as friends. You know, they weren't Quakers. And so they were the only ones who could enter the presence of the king unannounced, except when he was having sex with a woman. That was the only time that they could not go in unannounced. Now, Haman apparently had access to the king, which shows how much power he had. And Esther did not. And she was married to him. And it's obvious also that she didn't expect to see him anytime soon. He hadn't seen her in 30 days, and she didn't know when she was going to see him again. She chooses not to request an audience. I don't know if she expected to be ignored. Maybe she didn't want to arouse suspicions as to her intentions in the court. We don't understand why she was reluctant to do so. But we wonder, don't we? I mean, aren't you thinking this? Whether after 5 years of marriage, Xerxes' desire for her has maybe cooled a little bit? In any case, she fears that if she goes into him, he will not extend the golden scepter. Now, when my wife comes into the room, I usually extend the scepter. One commentator describes Esther, listen to this, as a poor blind queen living in her little self-centered world. And she needs a Mordecai to shame her out of her despicable selfishness.
Bogus.
Now, we talked about how Esther is a person who changes a lot. She really grows during the time of this book. And I think that this commentator may have been very right. But I don't know what you think about Queen Esther's reticence. Was it reasonable? Was it understandable? Should she have gone along with Mordecai? Would that have been wise? But what we see in Esther, I believe, is a transition in her character. And so Mordecai sends a message back to Esther. He is absolutely inflexible at this point. He will not let Esther delay or try to act another way. And what he says to her essentially is this: although you may not act, deliverance for the Jews will come from another quarter. Now, he didn't say exactly like that, but I think that's essentially what he was saying. The idea, I think, is that God has an infinite number of ways to accomplish his will. I don't know if you are familiar with Adrian Rogers. I think he's dead now, but he was a Southern Baptist preacher, very well known. How many of you have heard of Adrian Rogers? Okay. He once said, he did in a sermon about prayer, he says, prayer is learning the will of God and getting in on it. And so then you pray the will of God. Does that make sense? Learning the will of God and getting in on it. And I think that's kind of what Mordecai is saying. He has an infinite number of ways to accomplish his will. We may fail to do what God wants us to do, but God will accomplish his will with or without you. Now, many interpreters over the years have seen in this passage a possible allusion to God, when he says, if from another place, as kind of a euphemism for God. If that's what it means, then Mordecai's statement means that if Esther fails to act, God himself will intervene, although he doesn't mention the name God. Now, by the way, if you're confused by this, don't be, because these words have been debated at length for many centuries, and I don't think we're going to determine today, what it actually means, but it certainly, to me, opens the door to God, even if it doesn't explicitly mention him. Remember, God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. Okay. Now, the last words of Mordecai's final appeal to Esther have been taken by many as the high point of the book. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. Now, I don't know about you, but that sure sounds like the doctrine of providence to me. And so as Mordecai reminds Esther, it's no accident that she is who she is. And that she is where she is at this time of her life. It just didn't happen that, God placed you there, I think he's saying. Or he's implying it anyway. And so it's only after hearing this final argument from Mordecai and his veiled threat that she decides to act as he wishes. And so she's not gung-ho at the beginning. Far from it. Perhaps she glimpses a great vision of the purpose of her life. We're never told what she was thinking, only what she decides to do. And so she then, honey, are you ready for this? She then gives Mordecai a command, which he went and carried out. Okay, Esther 4:15. Oh, you gave it to somebody else. I asked you to read. Okay, who's reading that?
I was confused. It says Tess on this piece of.
I asked her to read it, but I wanted her to read it, but because her beautiful melodious voice. But you go ahead.
I'll try, Bob.
You won't sound like her.
Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions.
Okay, thank you. Now, chapter 4 ends where it began, doesn't it? With the focus on Mordecai. But notice how things have changed. Mordecai is no longer in charge of the rescue plan. Esther is. And Mordecai leaves the open square to carry out her orders. Before he was given the orders, now she is. All of a sudden, she has changed to an increasingly confident Queen Esther. And when the situation becomes crisis mode, Esther, I believe, was brought to the defining moment in her life by circumstances over which she had no control. Now think about it. Esther was forced to choose between identifying herself with the covenant people of God, the Jews, or continuing to live as a pagan in the king's court. Now, apparently no one in the court, including her own husband, knew that she was a Jew. And to save her people, she would have to reveal her own identity. She would have to admit, and this is hard, isn't it, to admit this, that she had not been living as a devout Jew should live. Furthermore, she would be identifying herself as a target of destruction under Haman's decree. And that would make her an easy mark in the Persian court, which, keep in mind, was full of double dealing and treachery. And it's at this moment that Esther has to decide who she really is. Up until this point, Esther has been a passive person. She has not initiated action. She follows the path of least resistance. Does that sound familiar? And then comes the defining moment. It is at this point, I believe, that Esther is transformed into a person of heroic moral stature. The providence of God. God has placed Esther in that era of history, in that city of Persia, and in that bedroom of Xerxes, so that when the moment comes, God can fulfill his ancient purposes through her. And while her people fast with her, she will find the courage to identify herself as a Jew before her husband Xerxes, regardless of the consequences. Now, Mordecai's conviction that Esther used her position and power for such a time as this has inspired others to recognize the hand of God, bringing together the right persons at the right time for the right reasons. Let me give you a shining example. How many of you have ever heard of a man by the name of William Wilberforce?
Of course.
Of course. Almost 200 years ago in England, he was a British member of Parliament who was thinking of leaving politics. He happened to have a close friend by the name of John Newton. If you've never heard that name, he wrote Amazing Grace, and he wrote a wonderful autobiography, Out of the Depths. John Newton was a converted slave trader who invoked the story of Esther to convince Wilberforce to stay in politics. He told Wilberforce, and I quote, "God has raised you up for the good of the church and the good of the nation. Maintain your friendship with Pitt. Continue in Parliament. Who knows that but for such a time as this, God has brought you into public life and has a purpose for you." Now, Wilberforce listened to Newton and continued to use his position and power for the next 48 years. Now, do you know what Wilberforce is best known for now? Denny, tell us.
End of slavery.
He worked alongside other Christians to abolish the British slave trade, about 50 years before we did in the United States, to free all slaves in British territories and initiate reforms in education, healthcare, childcare, and prisons. The example of Esther. Okay, I want to just say a couple things here, and then we'll go let you go to church. Chapter 5, and we'll get into that next week. We have Esther's defining moment. It's unlikely that any of us will ever be in a predicament such as that of Esther. But every one of us faces defining moments in our lives. Every day that a Christian lives, he or she is faced with defining moments that define us as Christians. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a powerful book some 80 plus years ago titled The Cost of Discipleship. In the book, he deplored cheap grace. In fact, he says on the first page, cheap grace is the deadly enemy of our church. He also wrote about Christians who exercise cheap grace. He writes of the folly of cheap grace, and I quote, "Well, let the Christian live like the rest of the world. Let him model himself on the world's standards in every sphere of life." What Bonhoeffer is saying, I think, is that after coming to Christ, some Christians continue to think and live as pagans. You know some of them. You worship with some of them here at FPC. They believe that they can live as they like because they made a decision for Christ sometime in the past. They take the path of least resistance instead of making the hard choices to obey God's word. Esther found herself between a rock and a hard place. How long, she found, can a person live like a pagan before one's true identity is revealed? I'll give you an example. How about the woman whose great desire through childhood and college is to become a missionary, but then she becomes engaged to a man who is an unbeliever? Those plans go by the wayside. You probably know someone like that. If you've gone to a Bible college, you know that a lot of people want to be missionaries. How many actually do? How many people get waylaid by the way? Anyway, that's all I have for you. Any questions or comments? You all are kind of quiet today.
You were on a roll, Bob.
I hope I'm not boring you. Okay, we'll pick this up. Read chapter 5 next week, please. Thank you for being here.